Hello and welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole and today we're going to talk about some books. So I am not in my normal setting. If you are a regular to my channel, we are currently on vacation visiting friends from where we used to live, and we're just staying at an Airbnb, and it is not like an aesthetic Airbnb, so like this is about as good as it gets. Anyway, that's not what you're here for. You are here for some books. I'm going to talk about just what I have finished since the beginning of this year. So I have two books to talk about, and yeah, I'm looking forward to talking about them because one of them was my first 5-star read. So the two books I'm going to be discussing today are Nickleby and The Trees. And unfortunately, I do not have either of these books with me, so as I talk about them, I will just put them up on the screen. Thus, it is actually kind of helpful to have some blank space in the background, I suppose. All right, let me talk about the first book. The first book I'm going to discuss is Nickleby by Charles Dickens. This is one of many works by Charles Dickens that I have read, and I am just going to go ahead and say right up front, I absolutely loved this book. And there are lots of reasons why, including that it just reminded me a lot of David Copperfield, which is one of my favorite books, or is my favorite book by Charles Dickens. And no, Nicholas Nickleby did not knock it off the throne, but it had the potential to do so. But before I get into why I loved Nicholas Nickleby, let me tell you a little bit of what this book is about. So it is all about the titular character, Nicholas Nickleby, who is a 19-year-old young country gentleman. He has grown up in the countryside outside of London with his family, had a very sort of charmed youth, and he suddenly finds himself at the age of 19, yes, having come of age, yes, being at the point where he should start, making his way in the world, but he finds himself, rather than having to go about it in the normal way with the support of friends and family, suddenly finding himself the primary breadwinner for both his mother and his sister. This came about by very unexpected events, which I won't reveal, but are definitely in the very beginning of the story. And this leads to Nicholas suddenly finding himself having to fend for his rights, his family's rights, support them, and make his way in a world that is none too friendly. It is full of people, including other family members, who don't have their best interest in mind and really are looking for opportunities to cheat and possibly even betray them. Friends will come up in places that aren't expected, and those who you think will have your back won't. And so the whole story then centers around Nicholas as he traverses and tries to figure out city life in London, how to become a man, establish himself in his own career, and also provide a stable home for his mother and his beloved sister, Kate. This turned out for me to be a very well-paced, plot-driven novel, which is interesting because a lot of times I find that Charles Dickens' works focus a lot on the characters, but I really felt like this book was just as much driven by the actual plot and the end goal as it was by Nicholas's character itself. You still get all the marvelous Dickensian characters that you expect to get in a Charles Dickens novel. So what were some of the highs in this book? Per usual, for me, I found the characterization to be one of the highs in this book. Both the good characters and the bad characters were complex and complicated, but the good characters were just warm and friendly and joyous, and the bad characters were just so evil that you struggled to feel bad for anything that happened to them. You wanted them to get their just desserts, if you will. The other thing that I loved about these characters is that this is an earlier work for Charles Dickens, and I could see that because I realized mostly his later works, and I could see aspects of characters that he used later and maybe developed further in other works. Nicholas, to me, had a lot of the same subtle charms that you find in David Copperfield. There was another character that he met out in the countryside who reminded me a lot of how the characterization of his Ghost of Christmas Present works in A Christmas Carol. And so I just found that there were a lot of characterizations and familiar characters that occurred in this novel, but not in a way that was like, wow, couldn't you come up with something more unique. It was like revisiting friends that you felt like you kind of knew. Another thing that I love about Charles Dickens' characterizations is I think he does a marvelous job of just bringing all the warmth and vibrancy that you find in friendships and in love relationships and in family. I don't know what it is about his writing, and I don't know that I'm going to take the time to analyze it, but I just think he does friendships and family relationships so well, and you can just really feel it when it's happening in the book. You are convinced that these people are really good friends, and you just love the relationships. Even when it's sometimes maybe an insta friend, like that never bothers me in his books, even though I notice when it happens where it's like, okay, you guys suddenly became bosom buddies, but like I'm happy for them and I just enjoy their friendship written out on the page. And I think that was one of the highs in this book for sure. I also, per usual, loved the language in this book. There are just moments of absolutely beautiful writing in here, usually again related to the descriptions of friendships or the things that the friends say to one another. There are just so many quotable moments that the characters have that you're either just cheering for them or saying, yeah, take that to their enemies, or that just warm your heart with just how close they are. The dialogue between people in this book is just truly an amazing highlight. Probably the biggest low for me in this book, despite how much I loved it, was that there were definitely poignant moments that felt completely pointless. And let me explain what I mean by that. There were a couple of parts in this book, which was serialized, that definitely felt like we're in there to take up space. In fact, there's one whole section and almost an entire chapter in the book that Charles Dickens, even in his notes to his editor, said, I wrote the rest of this to take up space because I wrote everything I felt like I needed to say, but I knew you needed more words, and so I just inserted this other stuff. And, you know, that is definitely a downside of how serialization worked at that time. You know, you're aiming to publish something in a magazine, it has to take up a certain amount of space, and you're kind of locked into that, whether it makes sense in your story or not. And you can't, you know, you don't really have the freedom to make it another chapter or something like that, or to just end it there and move on and say, well, this week it's only going to be 2 pages. So he acknowledges that there's moments in that, and I think you see those moments in there in a couple of scenes. Somehow, though, even with that knowledge from the footnote that, like, this was a pointless scene that he added just to make this chapter longer, there was still a section in there that I absolutely loved and was one of my favorite parts in the book. So go figure. That said, I think there were also a couple of character moments and plot moments that, like, were only semi-satisfying. And like I can think of the resolution of a couple of character conflicts that definitely felt like, okay, I'm resolving the book and I guess I need to resolve this character because I did bring them into the story at one point, and kind of felt like, boop, there you go, it's over, you're out of the scene. I've finished you off, resolved you, whatever, you're no longer an issue. And particularly for one of the characters, I was like, but you built up the conflict between these two so high that that's it? That's all I get? And you're just like dismissing him and writing him out of the story. That definitely happened in this book. There were definitely a few characters who just kind of got written out of the story in their one serialized chapter, and it was like, okay, they're taken care of. So in that sense, I can definitely feel the youth, I guess, of Charles Dickens in his writing, in terms of, it struck me as, here's an author who's doing really well and is writing amazing stuff, but still is struggling to figure out how to wrap up all the conflicts that he's created. Because Charles Dickens creates a lot of conflicts and a lot of obstacles for a lot of his characters. So yeah, he gives himself a lot of work to resolve, and like at some point you're running out of pages, or you realize maybe nobody else is going to read this to the point where I actually write enough to resolve this. I don't know. But that was kind of a low for me. But despite that, I still enjoyed the characters. It did still feel resolved at the end of the day. It just maybe wasn't the most satisfying resolution to some of the conflicts. There were a couple of different themes and definitely a lot of universal ideas that were discussed in this book. There's definitely a lot of talk about class and class relationships to some extent. There was a ongoing discussion about like country versus city, which really was a symbol for sort of innocence in life versus like experience, in terms of like there was definitely a connection between everything that was related to the country was innocent and inexperienced and like unspoiled, and a lot of things related to the city or rascally of this world, dangerous or just cheats or just a ruined version of something. And so you saw that happen throughout in talking about different characters and where they were from, the types of work that people would do, the workers, the type of money you would make, and just how even the buildings and housing itself. And at the end of the day, I think this book was really a book that gave you a lot of really good insight into the difficulties that there could be in trying to make a living when you don't have a lot of financial or family support. Particularly in 19th century London. So there is a lot of focus on the working class and just sort of the struggle to go not even from working class to sort of like an upper class, but really to just sort of stay in that working class and actually make a living. So I think a good connection to today is it sort of discusses that entire idea of, you know, why a living wage is important and how people can fall in character if they're unable to actually provide and support themselves and their family in a meaningful way. At the end of the day, this book still got 5 stars for me, and that's because for me, a book does not need to be perfect to get 5 stars. I did overwhelmingly love this book. I enjoyed reading it. There were a lot of highs beyond the ones that I just mentioned, and while there was some downsides related to the plot and this and that, they weren't so much that it like stole the joy out of the book for me or ruined any part of the book. And I felt like at the end of the day, this was definitely a book that I would want to come back to again and again. I would definitely recommend this book to anyone who is a fan of Charles Dickens' work in general, especially if you've read David Copperfield before and really enjoyed that. I think this book will just feel really familiar to you. I was buddy reading it with a couple of other people, and one person commented that she just happened to be reading David Copperfield at the same time and almost expected these two characters to meet, and I would totally agree with that sentiment. I think this is a great Victorian classic that definitely focuses on an idea of found family and working life and trying to make your own way. And it is definitely, for me, one of his more plot-driven novels. So I would definitely recommend it to somebody who likes a more plot-driven novel versus a more character-driven novel, even though a lot of this does have to do with the maturation of Nicholas's character. That's that book. Let me move on to the next book that I read and finished. The next book that I'm going to talk about is The Trees by Percival Everett. This is the second book that I read by Percival Everett, and I just need to start out by saying that I knew absolutely nothing about what this book was about. So I'm hopefully going to give a synopsis that's not going to spoil anything, but will maybe set you up better and prepare you better than I was for reading this book. The Trees is a book that I would describe as being satirical, having a touch of surrealism in it, as well as being an odd mix of crime/detective fiction. And if that all sounds a little strange to you, it kind of is, but somehow it mostly works. At the end of this day, this book is covering and talking about and following some detectives as they investigate a series of murders that have occurred in small town Money, Mississippi. But these crimes are not just normal crimes. They seem to harken back to some hate crimes of the past as well as the present. So it is a novel that is meant to be like in the here and now, which adds to the element of mystery surrounding sort of the history of what's going on with the crimes that are taking place. This is a book that is blunt and full of dark humor, and I think you need to be ready for both. So let me talk about what some of the highs are in this book. First of all, I would talk about the language, which I would just describe as being a very direct attack on virtually everyone. There is strong language used throughout, both in the dialogue with the characters talking. They cut straight to the chase, and each character I feel like is more blunt about their thoughts than the next. I mean, Percival Everett knows what he wants his characters to say, and they do not beat about the bush. They get directly to the goal of their conversation, whether it is something that might be deemed as harsh or politically incorrect or not. There is just no filter. Additionally, I found the plot in this book to also be pretty fast-paced. There were a lot of short sentences, short chapters that were also right to the point. There was, I believe, one chapter that was actually just 1 or 2 sentences long. So you do keep moving through the book pretty quickly. You keep moving through the plot from one event to the next. And I thought it was really well and cohesively put together in that manner. I think the other interesting thing about the plot is you do have this sort of detective-esque type of feel to it. It's full of detectives and agents and this and that investigating murders, but done in sort of a like 80s crime show kind of feel to it. There's definitely some references and hearkening back to like how popular crime and detective TV shows were done. I don't watch a lot of those or read a lot of them, but even I kind of picked up on that feeling like that at times he's definitely making fun of like maybe how those are done, or just making fun of some of the perceptions that particularly Americans have about different, the police and different federal agencies surrounding the police force and that kind of thing. So hard to describe without really giving other subplots away, but I'll just leave it at that. So one of the lows for me actually also had to do with the language, and going back to the idea of blunt language, I would also say that the language in this book is pretty brutal, and you may want to look at some content warnings for that. Both the way that people talk to one another can be full of racial slurs in every which direction imaginable. So if that's something that you don't like in your writing or find too uncomfortable or just don't want to read, you should definitely look up more content warnings on that so you can anticipate it. You're probably also going to have to deal with the fact that there are a lot of characters in this book who are fat phobic. There is a lot of mention of weight, a lot of people being called fat, a lot of focus on weight in the book in general, which I'm sure is a symbol for something, but truly I struggled to unpack what that something was. So that is also some of the content that you should look up if that's something that bothers you in writing. And then finally, I did mention that there are murders in this book, and especially initially, these are described in graphic detail, and there is a reason and purpose to that. But if you do not like body horror in your book, this is something that you may also want to stay away from. I, in general, don't tend to like to read a ton of body horror. I don't read horror in general, and I was surprised at the amount of horror and horror-like elements in this book. And then my final other problem with this book was actually related to plot. It has sort of a semi-unresolved ending that is not that uncommon in literary fiction. I feel like a lot of modern literary fiction has kind of gone away with the idea of having to resolve all the conflicts, and certainly there's been a large movement away from having denouements in books, and those are literary terms you can look up if you want. But basically, the ending felt a little unsettled. There's no neat bow on this, and I don't necessarily need a neat bow. I can go with a messy bow, but I kind of like a bow. So personal preference-wise, that didn't sit that well with me, because I felt like rather than focusing on the idea or theme at the end of the book, I found myself more with questions about things that weren't resolved. And I don't think that was the purpose or intent of the ending. It did have kind of a creepy feeling ending, which was interesting. And overall, the book to me kind of felt like reading an Alfred Hitchcock movie. So if you like Alfred Hitchcock's movies and you like sort of the dark humor he will have in there and that horror-like but symbolic style that he has in his movies, there's some part of me that feels like you would probably also like The Trees, because I feel like there's some sort of strange overlap in how they tell a story, and certainly in how this story was told. That said, I did think this was a really good book. It took me a while to wrap my mind around the fact that it was definitely a satirical novel with a lot of heavy symbolism in it, which are two things that I don't necessarily always like together. And I think the bigger problem for me was just it was something I was not expecting in this book. And I think that was more my fault. Maybe I should have just read more about it. I don't know. But either way, I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars, way lower than I thought I was going to. I really thought I was just going to absolutely love this book based on what I heard. So I'm a little disappointed with that rating, but I do think that's pretty accurate for me. Themes that this story covers largely has to do with the historical hate crimes in the US and the justice or lack of justice surrounding them, as well as just the idea of looking at the humanity or lack of humanity given to victims of hate crimes. I would recommend this book to anyone who has read detective fiction, likes crime novels and/or horror, especially people who like literary fiction, and for people who don't mind an unresolved ending and a book that really makes you think about the symbols and what the underlying topics may be, because there's definitely not a lot in this book that is just given to you, which I don't think is a downside of the book. I just think it's something to know going into it. Like, do not take this book literally at surface value. There's a lot more going on than just the plot itself. That was The Trees for me. Very mixed feelings about that book. Glad I'm buddy reading it with people, and definitely still waiting for the rest of their comments to come in, because I still feel unsettled and like I have questions about this book. I might watch a few interviews with Percival Everett where he talks about this work. I feel like I need that. So that's it for today. And yeah, let me know if you've read either of these two books and let me know what your thoughts are on them. And I am thinking that going forward, I may change my weekly wrap-ups to just be about the books that I have read, partially because it will give me more opportunity to talk about them. Because I realized in including my current reads in with the books that I've finished, I end up not being able to talk about either sets of books that long. And talking about what I'm currently reading, I'm currently in the middle of A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, so you can look forward to hearing my thoughts about that in upcoming videos. If you want to stay very up to date about what I'm currently reading, I am trying to start making shorts and or community posts, putting up there what I'm currently reading, so you can see in real time what I am working on in my reading life. That's it for me today, and I'll talk to you next time.